A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The angel Gabriel was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph of the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And coming to her, he said, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. In this gospel story, the angel greets Mary with hail or rejoice. And that's all right. So far, so good. But I think it's the next line that troubles Mary a little. You have found favor with God. In those days, as in these, if you think about it, to find favor with God was definitely not always something to rejoice over. To be sure, to find favor with God meant that God had noticed you and loved you deeply, and that was a plus. But it also implied that God had a great task for you, a task that sometimes, maybe often, meant sacrifice and suffering. So that's why you really didn't want God to notice you. I mean, all we have to do is look back and see the reaction of some of those in the Old Testament whom God found favor with. For instance, Moses tried to duck God's call by protesting that he wasn't a good leader or speaker, and would Yahweh consider sending his brother Aaron instead? No deal. The prophet Isaiah, suddenly finding favor with Yahweh, said, "Now don't notice me, please. Don't send me, I stutter." And God said, "No problem," and sent angels with burning coals to correct his impediment, leaving Isaiah struggling to come up with another excuse. Jonah did his Robert De Niro thing when he was summoned. "Me? You talking to me? 'Cause I'm the only one here." And he ran the other way. Now you get somewhat of the same idea from C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. One of the children asks Mr. and Mrs. Beaver about Aslan the lion, who is the God figure. "Is Aslan quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion." "That you will, dearie, and no mistake," said Mrs. Beaver. "If there is anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just plain silly." "Then he isn't safe," said Lucy. "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good." Mary knew all this. No wonder she swooned and had to be quickly reassured by Gabriel, "Do not be afraid." But she was afraid. And it wasn't long after that that her fears were confirmed when old Simeon prophesied that a sword would pierce her heart. Mary's yes, sincere but hesitant, was given at a great price. And that is where her greatness lies. We often romanticize Mary as having an open, spontaneous, and generous heart, singing out her yes. Well, it was indeed generous, but only because it was tinged with fear and laced with trust. She had found favor, and she said yes, though surely her next thought was, what about what lies ahead? Finding favor with God is a mixed blessing. I make a point of all of this to remind you that at one time, perhaps long ago, each of us has had his or her own annunciation. Our annunciation was called baptism, when we, having found favor with God, were called and chosen. Perhaps like the others I mentioned, had we been of age or had our parents fully realized what it was all about, we too would have been afraid and asked for an extension. The fact is, to say yes to the mighty and wonderful God, it's both liberating and fearful, but we treat it so lightly. Today, because, as they say, familiarity breeds contempt, the call and response of baptism are taken on easily, almost casually. To have been found with God's favor is a precious treasure, but its ramifications should make us, like Mary, afraid, and yet, at the same time, excited with the challenge of making a difference in this world if we are true to that yes. You know, when I was young, whenever it rained, it was often cold. And so when my younger brother and I and my sister came home from school at the end of a rainy day, our mother often had a cup of hot chocolate waiting for us. And we so appreciated that, although we pretty much took it for granted. That is, until I left home. One time I went to visit my parents who had retired and were living in Tampa, Florida. It was cold and it was rainy when I landed. And I got off the plane, and as I came down the escalator, there was my mother waiting for me with a huge smile and, yes, a cup of hot chocolate. Now I live here in Boston, and there are many rainy, cold days, and oftentimes when I make myself a cup of hot chocolate, I think of that special combination of sweetness and warmth. Because this is what mothers do. This kind of natural generosity and love is just who they are. It goes with the territory. And it should be the same with our being a Christian. The moral, ethical life should be a natural thing that we Christians just do, even though it's a bit scary because it requires, out of love for Jesus, being countercultural with all the ridicule and the rejection, the hoots and the hurts, the being countercultural brings. The bottom line is that in finding favor with God, Mary was at a crossroad. And in her song to her cousin Elizabeth, she sang, "He who is mighty has done great things for me." But she also knew she would have to do great things for God in virtue of our baptism, our call. So it is with us.